With the help of Hashem, I'm sorry I was in bed the whole week today, and I didn't prepare for today's shir. I was extremely torn about whether or not to cancel tonight's shir or not. Basically, the whole week I ran a fever and a stomach bug, not corona. Don't worry, I don't have corona. But this whole controversy, he said it began in 1532. And ended in 1574. That means that the Shemitah, this controversy extended over 7 Shemitas. Okay? And as in the Shutaf Kasroichol, Siman Chav Gimel, Chav Dalet, Chav Hey, there's a whole bunch of simanim. Some of them are written by the Mabit, some of them are written by Rabbi Yosef Karo. They debated this issue as to whether or not produce that's grown in a field that's under non-Jewish ownership or under non-Jewish control, do the fruits have the status of Kedusha Shvias? Are they considered to be a Paris of Shvias? Nafkamina would be, are you allowed to do Schairai? Are you allowed to engage in commerce with them? Could you sell them? Could you buy them? Another Nafkamina would be Zman Biur, right? There's a certain deadline. If you have Paris of Kedusha Shvias, if you have fruits that have the sanctity of Shvias, there's a point in time at which you have to get rid of it. By the way, the theory that I mentioned last week is that the idea is that the Torah, Hashem doesn't want people to hoard Perish Shvias. I found that in the Ritva. Okay? So the Ritva says that. Basically, the Ritva says that the purpose of Perish Shvias is exclusively for consumption. It's meant to be eaten. Right? It's not meant to be sold. It's not meant to be bought. It's not meant to be an item through which you conduct business. Okay? So the Ritva already says that idea, so therefore the Torah wants you to get rid of it at a certain point in time, so you shouldn't hoard it. Okay, because if you hoard it, right, it's usually for business purposes. Okay, so that's the idea. That's what it says from the Ritva. What is the deadline? The deadline basically is when it's no longer available in the fields and the forests. Okay, when the fruits are not the fruits that basically no longer exist in the fields or the forests. So that's the point in time at which you have to get rid of. At which point in time you need to get rid of the Perish Shvias. Okay, so the question is, if you have fruits that were bought from the field that was under non-Jewish control, do you need to get rid of it or not? I want to point Menachem, our friend Menachem, who joins us remotely. So Menachem Nussbaum, so he pointed out some very interesting points. He mentioned about Rav Kook and the Heter Mechir. That I'll mention it for next week. So we did mention briefly last week. But Rav Kook had initially been opposed to the Heter Mechir, but then when he came here, he gave support to the Heter Mechira. So it was an interesting discovery from Rav Kook about the fact that the entire land of Eretz Yisrael was actually technically under the ownership of the Sultan, of the Turkish Sultan. So it actually was owned by non-Jews, but what happened is that the Jewish settlement was technically renting the land. So they gave their rental contract over to non-Jews during the year of Shemitah. That's something that Rav Kook discovered, which made the Heter Mechira much more viable, right? Much more acceptable. Okay, then he mentioned something about the Satmar Rebbe. He said that the Satmar Rebbe wrote an entire kuntrus against the Heter Mechira. The Satmar Rebbe was actually very opposed to the of giving. I haven't seen it yet, but I'm going to look into it. I know the Satmar Rebbe Shitas, but it's mentioned in Minchas Yitzchak. The Yitzchak Weiss, who the Gaiver of the Eirech HaReidis, has a tshuva opposing the Heter Mechira, and he quotes the opinion of the Satmar Rebbe. Not surprising, the Satmar Rebbe was very opposed to the Heter Mechira for a number of reasons. Right? Maybe we'll get to that in the next year. But apparently he says that the Satmar Rebbe, Menachem Nussbaum told me that the Satmar Rebbe stood from the Eirech HaReidis based on Yivul Nachri. Okay, this is also a very contentious topic. So we'll look at that next week's Shita, but I thank Menachem for providing me with that very interesting information. Okay, so I remember I discussed this topic with Rosh Hashiva, Rabbi of Oz, the Rosh Hashiva of Itri. If you don't know who he is, it's good to get to know who he is, because he's one of the great Gaon and one of the great Talmudic geniuses of our generation. But he found this extremely amusing. He said there was a certain Rav Varam that went to the Chazon Ish. I mentioned this last week. I didn't have the exact details who involved, but Rav Oizer told me that it was with Rabbi Baram. So Rabbi Baram went to the Chazon Ish, as there's an issue of Lifnei Iver. If you cause somebody else to do schayr, to do business with Perish Shvias, or the fruits of Parashvias that would be Lifnei Iver. But what happens if you cause somebody else to do business with a Paris of Yivol Nachri, right? Fruits that grew from a field under non-Jewish control. So would there be Lifnei Iver? So according to the Beis Yosef, it would be completely permissible, right? There wouldn't be any issue with doing it because according to the Beis Yosef, these fruits don't have the status of Kedusha Shvius. This is Yivol. Well, usually if you go to the supermarkets today, they already tell you Yivol Nachri. So in Bnei Brak, the Chazon Ish was so opposed to Yivol Nachri, the Chazon Ish held so adamantly that the fruits that were grown, produce that was grown in non-Jewish fields, what we call Yivol Nachri, I'm just going to refer to Yivol Nachri from now on. The Chazon Ish was so adamant that Yivol Nachri has Kedusha Shvius, the Chazon Ish told Rav Baram that it would be Iver to cause somebody else to do business with Yivol Nachri. That's how extreme the Chazon Ish was about it. So Baram said, but excuse me, how could that be Lifnei Iver? Whoever is doing business, Yesh Lema Milismach. He also was adamant, the Pa'ah Shulchan of Menachem ben Mishpav 250 years ago wrote a long treatise in defense of the position of the Beis Yosef. So how could that be regarded as Lifnei Iver? So the Chazon Ish says there's no two studying. The Chazon Ish was so adamant, he was so firm in his opinion that in his mind there was no other opinion. Right? Like the Mabit, right? Like Rav Moshe Mitarani, who fought with the Beis Yosef for 7 Shmitas on this topic. So Rabbi Oizer found it very amusing. He said that Rav Shlomo Zalman wrote a very important sefer on Shvius on a lot of the topics of mitzvahs atluis ba'aretz, agricultural mitzvahs that apply specifically in Eretz Yisrael, called Madani Eretz. Okay? Madani Eretz is a very important work from Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. And Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach has many simanim in the Heter Mechira. He's quite supportive of the Heter Mechira, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. And he says that there are 8 issues to tackle with the Heter Mechira. Okay? 8 different points that we need to deal with in order to permit the Heter Mechira. Okay, obviously, when we mentioned last week, is the problem of like Tichanim, not to give the non-Jews a foothold. You're not allowed to sell land. It's a Gemara of Avodah Chaval Kovez. You're not allowed to sell property to non-Jews. Mordechai Eliyahu got into not Mordechai Eliyahu, Shmuel Eliyahu, who's the chief rabbi of Tzfat, got into big trouble because he issued a psak in Tzfat that you're not allowed to sell apartments to Arabs. Okay, that was the psak that was issued by Rav Shmuel Eliyahu, and they took him to court. Okay, he got into big trouble because of it, but he stood his ground. Right? He said, I'm only representing the opinion of the Torah. That is what is stated explicitly in the Shulchan Aruch, stated explicitly in the Gemara, that you're not allowed to sell property in Eretz Yisrael to non-Jews. Okay, but that's racist, it's xenophobic, whatever, okay? So, and then that's an interesting point. Which reminds me, just today, the Torah doesn't really add up with modern values of liberalism. It does a lot of things that don't work together. A lot of things don't reconcile. Some things do, but not everything. Well, in today's Daf Yomi, we had an interesting case about the Rava. In today's Daf Yomi, Rava said that if I would have two cases that came before me, okay? So, 2 monetary cases. He says one case was brought to me by a man and the other case is brought to me by a woman. He says initially I would give preference, I would first deal with a case brought to me by the man because men observe more mitzvahs, so on account of them observing more mitzvahs, they get preferential treatment. I get to deal with their case before I deal with the case of the woman. But then Rabbi changed his mind. Rabbi said that he heard that it's considered a lack of dignity for a woman to have to wait in line. Today's Daf Yom, we learned that if a woman's waiting in line to receive Ma'aser Ani, tithes for the poor, you first give the woman, right, because the woman, right, it's not respectful, it's a lack of dignity for a woman to have to wait in line. It's more of an affront to her dignity. It's more of an affront to a woman's dignity to wait in line than it is an affront to a man's dignity. So he said then he would first take the case of the woman and then he'd take the case of the man. For example, the Mishnah is a Gemara in Hari, Daf Yud Gimel, a very problematic Gemara philosophy from the perspective of modern day equality. The Gemara in Yud Gimel, the famous case is that if you have to feed, it's based on a Gemara in Hari Yud Gimel. It is the Gemara in Hari Yud Gimel, but it's also ruled in the Shulchan Aruch, and if it's tzedakah, that if a woman needs to be clothed and a man needs to be clothed, you give preference to the woman. If a woman needs to be fed, a woman gets preference, but if somebody's drowning, you give preference to a man because he keeps more mitzvahs. If you save the man's life, he'll be able to thereafter keep more mitzvahs than the woman. Okay, so you have no choice. right? The woman could have more children, a man could also. So you see, this really, so on one hand, we're giving preference to women when it comes to feeding, when it comes to clothing. But when it comes to saving a life, that's not going to match up very well. That's not going to be well. Although I do maintain, and I have proof for this, I do have a personal conviction that is only when everything else is equal. Right? Which means to say that the halacha first looks at who's younger, who has a more, who can live more years, right? Who's a more upstanding person. If the man is a criminal and the woman is an upstanding person, it certainly save the woman. I'm absolutely certain that everything else is equal. So it's literally the toss of a coin. Okay? I mean, you literally have to flip a coin, so therefore the Gemara says the man will do more mitzvahs. But other than that, you give preference to the woman if she has some other reason why she needs to be saved. That's everything else being equal. Exactly. Right. Right. Exactly. So okay, that's just another topic that I'm just trying to match up. It's just very interesting. Today I saw a big discussion that there was a certain group of homosexuals in YU. They have their own society, and they want to be at YU. Yeah. So they want to be recognized by YU, by Yeshiva University. They want to get full recognition. I don't know the details of the case. You can look it up. So I'm speaking very vaguely. I really don't know the details of the case, but they want full recognition from the establishment from the official establishment of YU. So they took it to the New York court. Now this is the ironic thing. It came before a woman. The judge is a Jewish judge. Her name is Cutler. Right, so that was the argument. But again, there's a lot of laws that today, even a private business doesn't have the complete liberty to do what it wants. I mean, there was a case of a certain printing shop that a gay lobby group said they wanted flyers to be printed up that would announce a gay parade or wedding cake or something. So it's not so simple. It's not, there's no assumption that just because, right? So therefore, even if YU is, by the way, YU does get government funding, so that also creates an issue. Once you take federal funding. Right. I'm trying to get the name of this judge. Her name is Judge Lynn R. Cutler, Lynn Cutler, okay? Now this is really ironic. Somebody posted this. So Lynn Cutler, somebody posted this to me. So Lynn Cutler, she's actually an alumnus of Touro College, which is the division of YU, I believe, correct? No, I'm not, I don't think I'm using the microphone. So this is and also she was named in 91, she was named as the May alumnus of the month. So she's also a member of the Lesbian and Gay Law Association of Greater New York. And she was overseeing the case of the anyway, so I'm just saying that just a bit of irony as it comes. So I'm getting extremely off track over here. So where do we get back to what we were getting? Oh yeah, so Mordechai Eliyahu, so Shmuel Eliyahu gave us, so we said Shmuel Eliyahu, the Rav Tzfat, gave a halachic ruling you should not let to sell apartments in Tzfat the Arabs. Okay? That's another point. So that didn't match up properly, with the values of not discriminating, what have you. Okay, so Rosh Shlomo, my Rosh Hashanah found this very amusing. So Rosh Hashanah wrote he dealt with 8 different points of contention that pertain to, Heter Mechira. And Rosh Hashanah said the first 3 of the 8 I'm not even going to deal with, because off the bat, it's obvious that there's not an issue. And he said the first issue of Yevul Nachri, whether or not the fruits, crops that are grown in land that's controlled by non-Jews, whether or not it has Kedusha Shvius, he said it's already a given, it's obvious that it doesn't have Kedusha Shvius. He said, I don't even need to deal with that. Meaning to say that the Beis Yosef's position is a given, so I'm not even have to deal with this. Rosh Hashiva was laughing, he said he found this very amusing. The Chazon Ish, somebody comes to the Chazon Ish, and the Chazon Ish says that there's no Tut Stadim over here. I'm not even going to hear the other side that the fruits of Yevul Nachri don't have the status of Kedushas. Of course they have the status of Kedusha Shvius. So Shlomo Zamor says off the bat, it's obvious it doesn't have Kedusha Shvius, I don't even need to deal with it. I mentioned this to Rosh Hashiva because Rav Chaim Kanievsky, Zachaim Levach, just passed away, so he has his most famous work, his Magnus Opus, is the Derech HaEmunah. It's basically like in a similar format of a Mishnah Berurah on the Rambam It deals with all the agricultural topics, all the halachic agricultural issues. So in Derech Hamuna, obviously the Chazon Ish adopts the opinion of Rav Chaim Kanievsky is a nephew of the Chazon Ish. Rav Chazon Ish molded Rav Chaim Kanievsky. So, obviously Rav Chaim Kanievsky completely adopted the position of the Chazon Ish. Somebody mentioned something amusing to me. He said that they had a recording of Rav Chaim Kanievsky, and he asked him, are you allowed to argue on Rishonim? So he says, yes, at times you're allowed to argue on Rishonim. As it was known, the Chazon Ish sometimes they would argue on Rishonim. And then they played another clip where somebody asked him, are you allowed to argue on the Chazon Ish? He says, no, you can't argue on the Chazon Ish. The Chazon Ish, what he says is the bottom line. Okay? So that was so obviously the Chazon Ish. So I told him Rosh Hashiva that I was going through Derech Hamuna on Yevul Nachri, the Rambam's opinion. I said he mentioned both opinions. Rosh Hashiva said he didn't mention both opinions because he didn't quote Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach in Madani Erez. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach contributed some very important information, some very important arguments that are important in the defense of the Heter Mechira, right? Which isn't Rabbi Yisrael Meir Lau said that he personally heard from Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach says we need the Heter Mechira. Okay, and he says I know you're going to face a lot of opposition with regards to the Heter Mechira, but we need it, and therefore you're allowed to stand your ground in order to defend the Heter Mechira. Okay, most of the Haredi establishment is extremely opposed to the Heter Mechira. The Chazon Ish obviously was the leading opponent against the Heter Mechira.
For the reason
of Leitichaneh, for two reasons. Number one, the Chazon Ish held it wouldn't help because the Chazon Ish was adamant that Yevul Nachri still retains the status of Kedusha Shviyis, and also the Chazon Ish was absolutely adamant that there's a problem of Leitichaneh of selling non-Jewish land to Jews. And he said, therefore, the farmers who appoint an agent to execute the sale for them, it's not effective because there's a yesod, there's a principle of ein shlich l'dvar veira. If I appoint an agent to commit a sin, the shlichus, right, the agency is completely null and void. So therefore, he says the mechira is not effective. Yeah, we're going to get into the reasons. Today we'll see the reasons. Today I'm extremely tired. I was in bed literally the whole week, so I was No, it's okay. It's okay. I'm fine. As you can see, I'm a little bit going off in a little bit more in tangents today. But as you see, I didn't even have strength to put together a new set of Marmakaimis. So, basically, as we said already last week, that the Beis Yosef said the minig in Eretz Yisrael, in his time, in his lifetime, that nobody treated the produce of non-Jews, nobody treated it with Kedusha Shviyas. But then as the Maharid, the son of the Maharid, who eventually became the chief rabbi in Turkey, and that was testified by the Haredim, who was living in the lifetime, was younger, but lived in the same lifetime as the Beis Yosef and the Mabid. He maintained that towards the end of the Chazid, of the Beis Yosef's life, at the very last Shemitah, which was in 1508, which was we said in 1574, so we said in 1574, the Mabed gained the upper hand. Okay? Now I'll mention something interesting. There's a book they put out Shut Afkas Reichel, they blau in different shuls. You notice they put out Sfarim. So somebody put out a collection of all the Shelis and Chuvas of the Beis Yosef and the Mabed together with footnotes. And he also included the entire treatise of the Pashulchan and also a treatise of the Chazon Ish and the Maharit, and he basically collected and made a compilation of all the different shuvas and all the different essays that were written by the early Achronim and by the later Achronim regarding the topic of Yevul Nachri. So there he says something very interesting. He quotes one of the Sfarim. Now I can't attest to the veracity of this, but this is what's written in this in the compilation of shuvas. He calls it the Shut Afkas Reichel. He says that with the Gra, as I know that the Gra started to make a journey to come to Eretz Yisrael. The famous Igeres Gra, he left a letter, he left the last will and testament to his wife and to his kids about moral behavior, a lot of ethical behavior. It's called the Igeres Gra. So the Gra already started to make the journey to Eretz Yisrael. According to the Hagdama there's a sefer called Kol HaTorah. Now Kol HaTorah was allegedly written by Rav Hillel Mishklov. A good chunk of it probably was written by Mihil Mishklov, but it's very controversial. There's a lot of basis to believe that some of the descendants of Rav Hillel Mishklov made additions into the Sefer. So not everything in the Kol HaTorah, I'm not sure if everything in the Kol HaTorah could be relied upon, but there definitely is a lot of legitimate stuff in the Sefer Kol HaTorah. But the Kol HaTorah is a very important work for modern religious Zionism. Okay, it's a very Zionistic work. So Rabbi Hillel Mishkla, in that book, in today's version of Mishkla, it's written that the reason why the Gra stopped his journey, he returned back to Lithuania in the middle of his journey. It says because Yaakov Avinu made a revelation in a dream to the Gra, and he told the Gra, "You're Bechin of Moshe Rabbeinu." Moshe Rabbeinu was not allowed to enter the land of Eretz Yisrael, so therefore the Gra, you are a spark. There's such a concept in Kabbalistic writings about a nitzutz or a shirish neshama. You know, a lot of you can look in Shari Gugulim. There's a lot of Kabbalistic stuff about soul roots and what have you. So it says you're a sense of nitzutz of Moshe Rabbeinu, so therefore you're the Moshe Rabbeinu of the generation. You can't come to Eretz Yisrael, but your Talmidim, your students are the Bechina, they have the aspect of Yehoshua. Yehoshua was the Talmud of Moshe Rabbeinu. So they're going to initiate and that was the case. A group of 21 students of the Gra came to Eretz Yisrael. Most of them settled in Sfad. 7 or 8 of them settled in Yerushalayim. And they and their descendants, most famously Rabbi Rivlin, okay, they basically sacrificed, they set up the nucleus upon, which all the later settlement was based upon. Okay, so they drained the swamps. It was the descendants of the students of the Gra that they drained the swamps. They set up the first Nachlat Shiva, the first neighborhood outside of the old city. They set up Meisharim, and many of the neighbors, Nachlaot, many of them were set up by Rabbi Rivlin and his companions. Okay, so indeed, the nucleus of Jewish settlement in the modern area was thanks to the students of the Gra. But in this Sefer, in the Shuskav Askas Reichel, they made the extraordinary claim that the reason why the Gra decided to go back is because the Gra personally maintained, like the Mabit, the Gra was of the opinion that the produce of Yivol Nachri has Kedusha Shvius, and was concerned about the Nidui. Right? We saw last week that the Beis Yosef, towards the end of his life, they gathered together in the Beis Medrash, and they issued a Nidui, an excommunication, against anybody, right, that would treat the produce of Yivol Nachri as Kedusha Shvius in order to exempt it from Trumas HaMaisros. Right? In other words, that's how passionate the debate became. The Beis Yosef and his school, who maintained that the produce of Yivol Nachri does not have the status of Kedusha Shvius, they issued a nidui against anybody that would contradict their position and not take Trumas HaMaisros. So because remember, there's two sides of the coin. Right. So there are always two sides of the coin. As the Mabit held that the produce has Kedusha Shvius, and therefore it is also exempt from having to take Trumas HaMaisros. The Beis Yosef had maintained that it does not have Kedusha Shvius, which means that you do need to take Trumas HaMaisros. Okay, so there's two sides of the coin. There's a leniency and a stringency. Okay, we'll see that the lenient and the stringent seem to be mutually inclusive, at least according to the Mabed and Rishon, they're mutually inclusive, but according to the Chazon Ish held you have to be machim on both accounts. There was a stei ha'aretz held you can be mekel on both accounts, but let's leave those opinions to the side for now. So now there's a debate. So according to this version, the Gra, the Gra was of the opinion that you don't need to take Trumas HaMaisros. Okay? Excuse me. The Gra held that it has Kedusha Shvius, and therefore you don't need to take Trumas HaMaisros. But anyways, according to this version, the Gra disagreed with the Beis Yosef. The Gra aligned himself with the Mabit, like the Chazon Ish. Right? The Gra personally was of the opinion that the produce that's one of Yivol Nachri has the status of Kedusha Shvius. Okay? So the Gra didn't want to conflict with the Nidui. He didn't want to get himself involved in the Nidui, because remember the Beis Yosef, they issued a Nidui against anybody who would contradict their opinion. The Gra disagreed with the Beis Yosef. Therefore, he didn't want to have to get into the problem of dealing with the nidui that was issued by the Beis Yosef. He said that's one of the reasons why he turned back and even come to Eretz Yisrael. That's the extraordinary claim. I can't vouch for it. It does sound a bit sketchy. I know it doesn't sound correct. It doesn't sound reasonable. The Gra wouldn't come to Eretz Yisrael because he didn't agree with the Beis. Okay. Now the question is, there's a little bit of a discussion that when they issued the nidui, right, what if somebody would be stringent on both accounts? What happens if somebody would treat the produce with Kedusha Shvius and also take Trumas HaMaisros? So therefore, he's being stringent on both accounts. So there's a disagreement right. Exactly. There's Johnny Auman, They asked Johnny Alman in the last version of the Mizrachim. They asked Johnny Alman, when you saw the king of Sweden to receive the Nobel Prize for Economics, did you make the bracha? So you think he said Roshal Yisraeli told him not to make a bracha. But he said he did meet the king of Jordan, and there is more of a compelling case to make a bracha that one would make on a king. Shechalak mechvayda lebasar v'dan. That's a bracha that you make when you see a king. According to many opinions, you can only make such a bracha on a king if he has the status, as he has the power to execute people. Right? There's the power to give people capital punishment. Yeah. See, that was a make a bracha. So Johnny Alman said some people make a bracha without Shem Machos. Johnny Alman said, Professor Johnny said, I don't do that. Right? I'm not in favor. Either you do it or you don't. Right? He doesn't like this gray man. Okay, sometimes you have no choice. It's always nice to be able to issue a conclusive affirmative psak, but sometimes you have no choice. You have to, like we talked about surrogate motherhood, right? Who's going to be able to determine for certain? We made the case. I personally favor the case that the birthing mother is the mother. Right? But if the case actually came before me, of course I would make them do a giur. Right? Yeah. About surrogate mother. Right? So it's the same thing. Johnny Alman would probably be opposed to this idea of, okay, I have this evil nachri, so I'll play it safe. What I'm going to do is, I'm going to treat it with kedusha shis, and I will also take trumas and ma'asos from it. Okay? So the question is, why did the Gra have to turn back? The Gra had to go back to Eretz Yisrael, had to go back to when you couldn't come to Eretz Yisrael because he didn't want to get in trouble with the Nidu of the Beis Yosef. Don't get in trouble with the Nidu of the Beis Yosef. Take Trumas HaMaishos and then you'll be clear. You won't be subject to the Nidu because the Beis Yosef only said anybody who's lenient against his opinion. So the Mahashardam, the Mahashardam was in Saloniki, one of the great poskim, shortly after the era of the Beis Yosef. He claims, the Mashadam claims that the Nidu was that the Nidu was issued, right, even against people that were stringent against their opinion. You follow what I'm saying? In other words, the Beis Yosef said that according to the Mashadam at least, even if anybody who would treat Yivul Nach with Kedusha Shvius was subject to the Nidu. The Beis Yosef wanted to cement his opinion, but the Nidu didn't see it. I don't think that Mashadam's case is more convincing. I think it's more convincing that the Beis Yosef only issued the Nidu for anybody that would be lenient against the opinion of the Beis Yosef. What does that mean to be lenient against the opinion of the Beis Yosef? You fail to take Trumas HaMaisros. According to the Beis Yosef, this doesn't have the status of Kedusha Shvius. If you fail to take Trumas HaMaisros, then you'll be subject to the Nidu. Which means the Gra could have come to Eretz Yisrael, and you could have played it safe, and you didn't have to go back to Lita, so therefore the whole thing is a bit sketchy to me. Okay, but in any case, also, it didn't seem that the Nidu was very effective, because you see that at the end of his life, the Mabit gained the upper hand. When the Beis Yosef at the end of his life was in Egypt, he was in the hospital, the Mabit gained the upper hand when they started to treat Yivul Nach with Kedusha Shvius, and they weren't taking Trumas HaMaisros. The Chareidim already testifies that, and the Shla already testifies that they began to conduct themselves in accordance with the Mabit. Yeah.
People could have nothing to eat at all.
Right.
But back then.
It says, if you don't have Yivul Nach, what are people going to eat? Right, people don't have Yivul Nach, exactly what are you going to eat? Right, yeah. I don't know. No, what they could do is they would either have to import, whether they would import from Ammon or Mayav. That's what they would do. They would import from Ammon or Mayav. What? Yeah, it was very hard to do that. The Gemara says actually in Ammon and Mayav, they didn't subject Ammon and Mayav, the lands of Ammon, which is mostly modern day Jordan today, they didn't subject it to the laws of Shvius because the people needed to have something to eat. So there needed to be an option to import fruits from the land surrounding areas. And that is exactly why they didn't subject Ammon and Mayav to the obligations of Shvius, so that there should be some sort of option, there should be some alternatives that people could eat during the year of Shvius. Okay? So, let's get to some of the material, right? Let's get straight to part 4, right? Of, 27, number 27 on the reference sheet. So, here it says, it's a Gemara in Gittin Daf Mem Zayin, a very important Gemara. So we have a disagreement between Rabbi and Rabbi Lezer. Let's read the first opinion that's in bold, the opinion of Rabbi, that says that Ein kin lo'evet kachavim be'eretz Yisrael afki midei meiser. non-Jewish control over a piece of land in Eretz Yisrael doesn't have the capacity to uproot it from Meiser. In other words, the land retains its kedusha, it retains its sanctity, even if it's under non-Jewish control. Okay? Why? Shnemar. So go ahead. No, presumably not, because once it goes back into Jewish control, certainly the non-Jewish control makes no impact. No, they've always been under Jewish, because the kedusha shnik kitchel ashad, the kitchel asad lavai, that's the side of the Gemara. That means to say when Ezra came up, so they basically, he sanctified the land and it was sanctified permanently. The other Mitzrayim, when we came out of Mitzrayim, we sanctified a greater mass of land. There was much more land that was sanctified and that assumed the status of Eretz Yisrael, but it wasn't permanently sanctified. Right? So therefore the lands that were only sanctified when we came out of Mitzrayim and that were not sanctified when we came from Bavel don't have the status of Eretz Yisrael. Okay? So today they only have the status of Eretz Yisrael on those lands that were sanctified by Ezra in the second coming, in the second entry into the land. Okay? So basically, Gemara in Gittim Mem Zayin says that's Rabbi's opinion that a guy doesn't have the capacity to uproot the sanctity of the land, to exempt that land from all the different halachas, all the different laws of Kedushas Eretz Yisrael, like Trumos Semaisus, etc., etc. Okay, Rabbi Lazar has a dissenting opinion, but we rule like Rabbi that a guy doesn't have a kinyan, that a guy doesn't have the capacity to uproot the sanctity of the mitzvahs in the land. That's number 28. That's the Gemara in Bechayris, Tafsir Aleph, for the Gemara in Bechayris states unequivocally like Rabbi that Ein Kin Lo Yeved Kachav Meretz Yisrael of Kim Midei Meiser. The Gemara in Bechayris doesn't give two opinions. The Gemara in Bechayris states unequivocally like Rabbi, and that's why the Rambam in number 29 in your reference sheet rules like Rabbi that an Akum can read the wording of the Rambam, Hefes Truma Perek Aleph Halacha Yud, Akum Shekana Karka Be'eretz Yisrael. You have a non-Jew that has bought land in Eretz Yisrael, lo yavkim in a mitzvahs. He hasn't uprooted that land to be subject from all the mitzvahs that Jewish land is normally subject to. Al-Arabik to Shata, it retains its sanctity. Okay? So therefore, the opinion at first glance, the Hanocha Pshuta, if you'd like, the assumption would be like the Mabit. If we didn't hear otherwise, we would just assume like the Mabit, that if the Rambam ruled unequivocally that the land retained its kedusha from mitzvahs, I would assume that the produce that's grown in the land of a guy, Yivol Nachri, I would assume that it doesn't have that it still has kedusha shvius, because the Rambam said that the purchase of a non-Jew, if a non-Jew makes a purchase of land in Eretz Yisrael, it doesn't uproot the land from its sanctity, so presumably it still has the status of kedusha shvius. Okay, so the Rash. Right, there was a Reb Shlomo Soloi. In terms of that, wrote an important commentary on the Yerushalmi. He lived slightly before the Beis Yosef. Now, we think about talking about the Mabit, but Reb Shlomo Soloi, who wrote this parish on the Yerushalmi, he was the first stage in the era of the Beis Yosef to take up the opinion of the Mabit, which means to say that the Mabit was basically supporting the opinion of Reb Shlomo Soloi. Okay, and the Beis Yosef was originally arguing with Reb Shlomo Soloi, and then the Mabit came along and defended the opinion of the Mabit. Now the Mabit in Nafkas Reichel writes that some of the proofs of the Reb Shlomo Soloi I support, some of the proofs aren't so compelling, but the bottom line is, halacha l'mais, the bottom line is that he sees the Mabit and Reb Shlomo Soloi both saw eye to eye, they both agreed, they held the opinion, they were of the opinion, like the Chazon Ish, if you like, that produce that's grown in non-Jewish land in Eretz Yisrael still has the Kedusha Shvius, as the Rambam states, seemingly unequivocally, that a guy doesn't have the power to uproot its Kedusha. Okay? So for Reb Shlomo Soloi, that was enough of a proof. Okay? The Mabit said, okay, that's not such a compelling proof. But anyways, if you move on, look at number 30, the Tosefta, that's another proof. I marked this as the first proof. Okay? The Rashmi Soloi held this to be compelling proof. What is the Tosefta in Shvius and Perek Vav? It says, Ein moichin, you're not allowed to sell. Ve'ein loichin min hagoy, you're not allowed to buy produce from a goy, from a kusi or a kuta, a Samaritan, right? And peirus, fruits, shvius, during the year of shvius. So now, the Tosefta doesn't distinguish between a case where the guy is selling you land that grew in the Jew's field versus a case where the produce grew in his own field. If you maintain like the Beis Yosef that Yevol Nachum doesn't have the status of Perish Shvius, you would expect the Tosefta to make a distinction, correct? Okay, that was the argument. The Tosefta just states unequivocally, without making any distinctions, the Tosefta state, you're not allowed to buy Perish Shvius from a guy. Why are you not to do Schaira? Not allowed to engage in business with the fruits of Shvius. Okay? So that was the first proof of Tosefta. Number 31, the Rambam also, same Rambam, Akum Shekana Karka Beretz Olif Kimen and Mrs. Eller Biktushasa. Okay? So, again says the Mabid, number 32, this was the Tshuva in the Mabid, if the Rambam distinguished between a case where a non-Jew or a Goy is selling you fruits, the Rambam would distinguish between a case where the fruits grew in his own field, in the Goyish field, versus a case where the fruits grow in a Jewish field. You would expect the Rambam to state a distinction. How could the Rambam state unequivocally that an Akum doesn't uproot the sanctity of the land vis-a-vis the mitzvahs of Eretz Yisrael, without saying that there's a difference between Shumas and Maisus and Shvius? Seemingly, presumably, the Rambam says with regards to all matters, the Rambam maintains that a guy doesn't have the capacity to uproot the status of Shvius. Okay? The Mabit finds the second piece of the Rambam more compelling. Look at number 33 in your reference sheet. The Yesh Kinel Akum B'Surya. Now there was a big discussion about Surya. Surya is more or less in current day Syria. Okay, now what happened is that David HaMelech conquered Syria. Now the question is, the Gemara has a long discussion in Gittin when David wanted to expand the borders of Eretz Yisrael and he conquered the territories of Syria. He wanted to do because the Jewish people needed more land, they needed more resources. So the question is, was it considered kibush yachid? Was it considered an individual, a private conquest, or was it considered a national conquest? If it was considered a national conquest, kibush rabin, then that would incorporate Syria as being part of Eretz Yisrael. But if it's a kibush yachid, it's considered an individual conquest, because originally he didn't go through the channels of the Sanhedrin. He didn't get full permission from the Sanhedrin. That's why it was very questionable as to whether or not David had the capacity to incorporate Syria as being part of Eretz Yisrael. The bottom line is that we don't treat Syria completely like Eretz Yisrael, but the Chachamim did confer certain statuses of Eretz Yisrael to Syria. So one of the issues that, one of the halachas is this also based on the Gemara in Gittin and Zayin. The Rambam Paskin is based on the Gemara in Gittin and Zayin, number 33 in your reference sheet. V'yesh kinyan la'akum b'Surya lafkim and amaisras. If a non-Jew owes land in Syria, it does uproot the sanctity of the land. So there's a difference between whether a non-Jew owns land in Eretz Yisrael proper versus a case where a non-Jew owns land in Syria. So in Eretz Yisrael, we may know this, the Rambam says, in Syria, a goy will have the capacity to uproot the kedusha of the land. So which means to say, if land is owned by a Jew in Syria, will subject that land to the laws of Shemitah, Shumas and Isis, what have you. But if a non-Jew owns land in Syria, right, then it won't uproot. So says the Mabed, this is more compelling. Before you could say the Rambam didn't make the distinction, but sometimes a Rishon writes something and doesn't tell you everything that you need to know. But here, we can make a very clear inference from the Rambam. It's only in the lands of Syria where we distinguish between Jewish owned land and non-Jewish owned land. By contrast, the implication in Eretz Yisrael, there is no distinction between land that's owned by a Jew and a non-Jew. Okay? So that's the proof of the Mabed, number 34, Kasa B'Samach, Ve'eshkinen L'goy B'Sur Lafkim and Amaisis and Shvius. Look at this, look at number 33. The Rambam says that a Goy has the capacity to uproot the Kedusha in Syria with regards to Maisrois. What's the second item? Min HaShvius. Now the Rambam says it explicitly. Min HaShvius. So therefore the Rambam says, Yivul Nachri from Syria, that you can treat as non-Kedusha, as non-Shvius produce. Okay, but Yivul Nachri in Eretz Yisrael, the Goy cannot uproot it. So you see that if you want to rely on Yivul Nachri, that's fine. You take Yivul Nachri from Syria, then you'll be okay. Right? Whether the Druze, they send apples. A lot of the Golani apples that we get are from Syria. They have a certain loophole because there are officially no open trade lines between Syria and Israel. But a lot of through the Druze, I remember they have some sort of arrangement where they're able to get the Golani apples from Syria into Eretz Yisrael using some I don't know how they do it, but somehow they found some loophole to avoid the issue, okay? So therefore, the Rambam permits Yivul Nachar, yes, but what type of Yivul Nachar? The Yivul Nachar is Soya. Right? So by contrast, by inference, that would mean the Yivul Nachar of Eretz Yisrael is not okay, or it still has the Kedusha of Shvius. That's the, the first proof of the Mabit. Now, let's look on the second proof, number 35 in the reference sheet. This is the Mechilta. The Mechilta spells out clearly what we mentioned a few times. That Shvius is a two-sided coin, which means that the produce of Shvius is not subject to the obligations of Trumas HaMaisos, right? So that's what why. How does the Mechilta learn? It says, "V'yishram toichel chayis asad." He says, whatever fruits are left over in the fields of Shvius, you can't take them and conduct schayra with them. You can't engage in business with them. But what do? Whatever's left over, the wild animals will eat. So the Mechilta says, "Lama nema." Why did that need to be said? What was that needed to? Why did the Torah need to say that? The Torah obligated you to take ma'asos. Shanani after shvius u'mashos. I write a student that have to take ma'asos even from shvius products. A man is compared to an animal in this sense. An animal, when the animals eat, the Torah says the animals will eat the parashvus. Do the animals need to take Trumas HaMaisos before they eat? Certainly not. Right? So therefore it's the same thing when you eat from the produce of shvius, you don't need to take Trumas HaMaisos. So just as when the animals eat from the produce of shvius, they don't need to take Trumas HaMaisos, so too when you eat from the produce of shvius, you don't need to take Trumas HaMaisos. And this basically spells they eat from the right, but in the context, correct. But in the context of shvius, the Torah made a comparison between you and the animals. Right? So the Torah was equating you and the animals in the context of shvuos to teach us something. What did it teach us? It came to teach us that the produce of shvius isn't subject to the obligations of Trumas HaMaisos. So the Mechilta is basically spelling out what we mentioned a few times, that there's a double-sided coin here, because if you treat Yivul Nachri as Kedusha Shvius, that will then exempt the produce from Trumas HaMaisos, but if it doesn't have the status of Kedusha Shvius, then it will be subject to the obligation of Trumas HaMaisos. Okay, and that's what the Rambam rules out clearly in Hilchos Matnas Aniyah, number 36 in your reference sheet, that Shnasa Shemitah Kol HaHafker Ve'en B'Lo Truma V'Leimasos Kol L'Rishon V'Lashem V'Maiser. On the produce of Shvius is completely exempt from any obligations of Trumas HaMaisos. Okay? The Tur, how does the Tur rule? The Tur in Yeridea, number 37, Shin Lamed Aleph. Shin Lamed Aleph is one of the longest simanim in Shulchan Aruch. The Tur come together. All the halachas that pertain to agriculture in Eretz Yisrael become together in one siman, Yeridea, and Shin Lamed Aleph. It's a very long siman. Okay, so the Tur in Shin Lamed Aleph states, B'Shvius, Yishmita V'Asa B'Charishu B'Zriya, V'Chol Avodas HaKarka. First, the Tur spells out the most basic obligation of Shvius, that one is not allowed to work the land. One is not allowed to plow, one is not allowed to seed, etc. And then the Tur mentions, V'Lei Maisis Kol L'Rishon V'Lashem V'Maiser Ani. Okay? First of all, the Tur states, V'Eretz Yisrael Idnim is Rabbanan. The Tur states that today, the Shvius is on Rabbanan. That's the accepted opinion. There's a very long discussion about the Rambam held on this. There's contradictions. Some sources seem to indicate that the Rambam held that, Shvius is Midoraisa. Other sources in the Rambam seem to indicate that Shvius is Manas as Rabbanan. Rosh Hashiva has a very long treatise to reconcile, and he says there's a middle ground. But in any case, if you look at number 38 on the reference sheet, these are the words of the Mabit. This is the second proof that the Mabit brings. He says all the Paiskim. What does he mean all the Paiskim? He's referring to the Rambam and the Torah. Stam, which means to say they didn't specify, they didn't make any distinctions. They said in the year of Shvius, everything is hefker, everything is ownerless, and everything is exempt from the obligation of Trumas HaMaisos. Says the Mabit, if produce of a goy was, if you maintain as the Beis Yosef maintains, that the produce of a goy doesn't have the status of Shvius, and it is subject, would you not expect the Rambam or the Tur to make such an important distinction? How could the Tur just state unequivocally that all the peiros, all the produce of Shvius are exempt from the obligations of Trumas HaMaisos? Don't you think the Tur should have told you that if it's growing in a non-Jewish field, that it's subject to the obligations of Trumas HaMaisos? Now, with regard to all these proofs, the Beis Yosef says it was extremely rare to have non-Jewish ownership. It says non-Jewish ownership during this era. I'm not sure if that's true. The times of the Torah, there were a lot of non-Jewish. But at least in times of no, it's hard to argue. It's hard to accept such an argument that in times of the Torah there were no fields under non-Jewish ownership. Okay, it's not such a compelling proof. According to the Mabed, you would expect the Torah at least to specify and let you know that if the produce is grown in non-Jewish fields, that it's subject to the obligation of Trumas HaMaasros. Okay? Now this is a really compelling proof, number 39 in your reference sheet. Now here's an important point. There's called an Isser Sfichin. What's the Isser Sfichin? You have the aftergrowth. Right? The aftergrowth. Sfichin basically say, if I own, for example, a cherry garden, a tomato garden. Okay, so I have a large garden where I grow tomatoes. Okay, so even if normally if you want the tomatoes grow, you need to plant them anew every year. But even if I don't do any planting, there will always be some tomatoes that fell on the ground. Right? And automatically, without me being actively involved, there will always be some cherries, some tomatoes growing the next year because of the aftergrowth of tomatoes that fall on the ground, and passively, even though I'm passive, you will have, so that's called Sfichin. Now, according to the Torah, the Kiva says that it's an Isser D'Oraisa to eat Sfichin. We maintain that Minatorah, you're allowed to eat Sfichin. The aftergrowth is called Sfichin. So we maintain that Minatorah, you're allowed to eat Sfichin. Now, why did the Chacham forbid Sfichin? The Rambam explains in Parashah Mishnayos, the Rishonim explains based on the Gemara, that there was a strong incentive for people to cheat with regards to Shvius. It's a big nisai, it's a big test. The person, that Rabbi Shmuel Bloom reports that there was a farmer that told him he's losing a $1.2 million revenue a year, right? Because he owns a lot of land. So he decided to keep Shemitah, so he's giving up on a $1.2 million revenue a year, which is extraordinary that somebody would be able to do that. But in the year Shvius, Chazal recognized that it would be extremely difficult for people to withstand the test. It would be very difficult for people to refrain from working the land the entire year. So what does he do? He wakes up in the middle of the night, or it's completely dark when nobody's looking, and he plants tomatoes. And then when there's tomatoes growing, he says, hey, what are you doing? He says, no, these are Sfichin. So I didn't plant them, they're Sfichin. So he'll plant, and then he'll make the claim that he didn't plant it, he'll claim that he's eating because of Sfichin. So what did the Chachamim do? The Chachamim came along and said, don't eat any Sfichin. Don't eat any aftergrowth. So therefore people know that vegetables that grow in the year of Shemitah are off limits. So that removes the incentive for people to cheat. It removes the incentive for people to secretly plant vegetables. Because even if they do plant vegetables, nobody's going to eat it because the Chachamim forbade the Sfichin. Is that clear? Okay, so that's why there's a rabbinic prohibition against Sfichin. So says the Rambam, this is a very important Rambam, the 39 reference. I'm going to read this Rambam. This is really a key Rambam over here. If you have a non-Jew that bought land in Eretz Yisrael, and he planted the non-Jew, he's not subject to the laws of Shvius. A non-Jew, he's allowed to plant in Shvius. The Palestinians are allowed to plant if they own the land. Okay? Perosei mutarim, their peros are mutar, meaning to say they're not subject to the prohibition of Sfichin. By the way, just to make another point, when we buy Otzer Beitin, which means to say produce of Shemitah, we're only buying the fruits. We buy the nectarines, the apricots, the apples, the bananas, because these are things that don't need to be planted every year. But you can't find tomatoes of Otzer Beitin, because tomatoes need to be planted every year, and therefore they're subject to the prohibition of Shvius. So if you wanted to eat the tomatoes or the cucumbers, or any crop that needs to be replanted every year, you would have to rely on Hetch Mechira, or Yivul Nachri. With the Otzer Beitin, so what does the Rambam say? The Perisei Mutarim, Shlei Gozer L'Sfichin. Right? They did not gozer, they didn't prohibit the Sfichin of a non-Jew. Why? Because what was the whole reason why they prohibited the Sfichin in the first place? Because of those that violated the laws of Shvius, that would wake up in the middle of the night and plant fruits. An Akum, he's not subject to that prohibition in the first place. He's allowed to plant during the year of Shvius. So therefore we don't need to prohibit his Sfichin. Follow that? So the Chachamim, when they instituted the prohibition against Sfichin, they only applied it to land under Jewish control. They didn't apply it to land under non-Jewish control because the whole institution of Sfichin was to deter the Oivre Avera, the sinners from planting the Shvius. A goy doesn't need to be deterred because he is allowed to plant in the year of Shvius. So therefore they didn't prohibit the fruits of Shvius. So here the Divrei Mabed brought a key proof in here. The Rambam clearly indicates that there's no Isha Shvichen as it applies to, there's no Isha Shvichen that applies to non-Jews. What about the other Yisurim? The inherent Kedusha that the fruits would have, the inherent Kedusha Shvius of fruits, that would exist. No, it still has Kedusha Shvius, because again, this whole, non-Jews are allowed to do Schayra, they're allowed to do Schayra with Perish Shvius. So you see that what's the clear emphasis? If you maintain like the Beis Yosef, that Yevol Nachri doesn't have to do Shvius altogether, it would be completely redundant for the Rambam to come along and tell you, oh, there's no Isra Svichim. How can the Rambam come along and tell you, listen here, mister, there's no Isra Svichim when it comes to the produce of non-Jews. Well, according to the Beis Yosef, there's no Kedusha Shvius in the first place. So if the Rambam needed to come and tell you, listen here, when it comes to Yevol Nachri, there's no Isra Svichim, it clearly implies that with regards to the etzem kedusha of the shvius, which means to say you have to get rid of bisman biur, you're not allowed to do schayra, and the other laws that pertain to the inherent kedusha of kedusha, that does apply. Okay, so this is a very compelling proof from the Mabit. Okay, the Kafter V'Ferach was one of the Rishonim. The Kafter V'Ferach, a very interesting personality. I even included a small biography from the Shub Bar Ilan, number 41. This is a story. Interesting name. He's a Yitzchak ben Rav Moshe Haparchi. He was one of the Chachmei Provence, southern France. Okay, then it was a region of its own. Chachmei Provence. The Chachmei Provence sandwiched right between the Balei Tosfot and the Spanish Rishonim. They had an influence from both. The Meiri was one of the Chachmei Provence. The Raiva, the Balamor, the Chachmei Provence. So this is a story. Okay, he was a Zionist, one of the early Zionists. So he came to Eretz Yisrael when there was very little settlement here. And he wrote a very important work, the Sefer Kafter V'Ferach. At that time, there was very little written about the agricultural laws of Eretz Yisrael. The Rambam wrote on it, but the Rif left most about the Rosh, didn't talk about very much about the laws of Kedusha Eretz Yisrael. So he wrote a work, Kafter V'Ferach. Now, Kafter V'Ferach is very important because he actually walked the entire land. He walked along the borders, and he mapped out Eretz Yisrael. So if you want to determine the borders of Eretz Yisrael, the Kafter V'Ferach is a very important work. Okay, a lot about what we determine what is Eretz Yisrael, what is not Eretz Yisrael, is based on the Kafter V'Ferach. Not everything in the Kafter V'Ferach is unanimous. There's a lot of controversy about some of the points in the Kafter V'Ferach. But you see, the Kafter V'Ferach, he put out a section in Perek Mem Zayin of the Kafter V'Ferach, Kedusha Shvius V'Isra Svichim L'Peres Nachrim, and he makes the exact same inference that the Mabit made. He says the Rambam states that there's no Isra Svichim when it comes to the produce of Nachrim. The inference is that, other than Svichim, it still has the inherent Kedusha of Shvius, because if it didn't have the inherent Kedusha of Shvius, it would be completely redundant to say that it's not subject to the laws of Svichim. How could something that doesn't have any inherent Kedusha of Shvius, how could one even entertain the possibility that something that doesn't have the inherent Kedusha of Shvius, how could one entertain the possibility that it could be subject to the prohibition of Shvius? Okay? That's 43. That's the next diuk of the Mabit. By the way, a lot of the proofs of the Mabit seem so compelling until Rav Chaim of Brisk and Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach expanded on the concept, one concept that deflected all the proofs in one shot. Okay, we're not going to see the Rav Chaim in this week. I started looking at Rav Chaim and I became very sick. I was in bed with fever and stomach bug, so I never managed to get through the Rav Chaim, but I got the basic concept of Rav Chaim, right? So you're going to see like 11. I basically summarized with 11 different proofs, which all seem, some of them at least, seem extremely compelling. And then all of a sudden, right, Rav Chaim comes along, right, and explains the Rambam, in a way where all these proofs are almost in one shot deflected. Okay, but that's, thank you, the key point, the key raya of the Mabit. It's already 9:30, we'll stop over here. Okay, I'd like to just do one more shir in Yevol Nachri, and then I want to get more to the issues of, after I do the third shir in Yevol Nachri, we're going to get to the topic of the Shichanim, right, which is the major issue, not to give the non-Jews a foothold in Eretz Yisrael. We'll deal with that Right? So we'll give one more shir for Yul Nachri. I don't want to, even if there's more to say, I don't like when topics drag on too long, especially this one where we're going to be carrying on. And therefore we're going to look at Hedge Mechira. After we do the third shir in Yul Nachri, we'll move on to Hedge Mechira. Okay? So I thank everybody for joining us. And we'll continue next week. Okay, we'll do one more shir in Yul Nachri. Okay? Thank you very much.